Okay, so the other day I had this really bizarre experience. I kind of wanted to share it with you guys and share some of my insights with it. So I laid down to take a nap, and I don't know if any of you have ever had it where you kind of went into kind of a lucid dreaming state, where you're kind of dreaming, but you're also in control of the dream as you kind of go through it. And I had this experience where I was just laying to take a nap, and didn't really mean to kind of enter a lucid dreaming state, but ended up that way. And I'd been thinking about this interesting concept before this happened. And the concept that was on my mind was, what would happen if I were able to transfer my conscience and all my memories, all my experiences into my 11-year-old self, and kind of how would that all play out. And it was kind of a funny idea. I'm sure, I know I think there's movie 17 again with Zac Efron. That's kind of the same thing, where he's able to take all of his memories, essentially just wakes up as a 17-year-old. And I thought about that. I was like, okay, if I could go back in the time, back when I was 11 years old, and essentially relive, the last 16 years, knowing what I know now, what would I do differently? And I think that I've asked a lot of people this question. I say, hey, do you have regrets? And everyone says, no, I have no regrets. I have no regrets, because they look at what happened in their life. They look at those experiences. They really did craft them. And so often when I hear people say, I have zero regrets in my life, it's probably true, right? They really probably don't regret all of the bad things that happened, all the bad decisions even, because it led them to where they are now. So with that being said, I realized that I don't regret all the things that happened to me, but if I know what I know now and I were to start over, and I actually had to start over, absolutely I do things very differently. Not a question in my mind now. I realized one of the first things, it was funny because I asked a few of my friends the same question, and we all went through the same pattern. The first thing everyone thought about was, well, I'd be really rich right now. I would know exactly when to invest in Tesla and Bitcoin and GameStop, and you'd know exactly the time frame on when to invest and when to pull out. It's like you'd be a billionaire. It would be very, very easy to make an obscene amount of money over a 16-year period if you knew which companies were going to pop, and also when they might crash again. So with that, I was like, oh well, okay, that's easy. And I started thinking about all the different scenarios I'd go through with that, and I realized that I would have an unparalleled understanding of future technology. Right, I'd be able to make predictions or innovations and of things that haven't been invented yet, but I would know about them. So it's just kind of it was an interesting series of thoughts. And here's where it kind of got a little bit fascinating. I started to think, okay, money kind of went aside, and I thought about okay, well, athletics, I would be just extremely good at so many sports because I understand so much more now. Just pieces, with age comes this experience. I understand pain differently now. I used to think that, I didn't understand what physical pain felt like until now. And I'm sure that when I'm 60, I'll have a whole different perspective on physical pain. And there was just compounding thoughts of athletics. And I was like, oh man, I go to high school and I would be like the king of high school. And it was just kind of a funny series of thoughts that kept on coming to my mind. And one thing that really stuck out to me, I was talking to my buddy, and I was like, yeah, I'd be like the king of high school. I was like, well, why do you say that? I said, because I now know that all these other 14-year-olds are just as insecure as I was. And back then, I thought I was the one that's insecure. I thought I was the one that had all these questions about myself. And I wouldn't say that I was a particularly mousy child as a 14-year-old. I think I was pretty outgoing, actually. And I wouldn't say that in any massive way I struggled with self-esteem more than the average, but it was interesting because I remember there being so many girls I just thought I could never ask out because, she's just way too pretty. And now I understand back then they were just as insecure as I was. And so that was kind of a funny thing too. Another big aha moment that hit me was there was a lot of people I wish I developed relationships with that I didn't. And that's kind of where this whole series of thoughts led me. Was I would have avoided a lot of bad habits. I would have set my patterns differently. I would have helped people that were in need. I now know some of my friends that struggle deeply now that back when I was 11, I could have said things or done things that would have changed their life. And it was funny because it wasn't rocket science type of stuff. I had a few friends come to my mind specifically that have really, really suffered as adults. And I thought, man, if I could have showed up when they were just in their teenage years and been a better friend to them, I think that their whole life would have pivoted differently. Or have just said, there was one friend in particular that had a very, very rough experience on an LDS mission. And I thought, man, if I just said these things to them before they went on this LDS mission, it would have been a whole different experience and they would have been so much more happy afterwards. So what was really insightful was recognizing that at the end of the day, the main things that I quote unquote regretted didn't have to do with money and didn't have to do with, things that I didn't get or things that it didn't have to do with my ego. It had to do with relationships. And a lot of them, there was a couple of core themes. The first one was that if I were to go back to when I was 11, I would have very little inhibition with approaching people, with being friends with people, with pursuing certain, romantic relationships, with pursuing friendships. I would have stopped trying to be friends with the cool kids. The cool kids all, frankly, most of them turned out to be losers. So I would have instead made friends with all the nerdy kids that I used to think, they're weird because they like anime. And funny enough, they're like the coolest kids now. And I used to think they were just kind of weird and dorky. And funny how that happened. They ended up being the people that I actually respect now. And actually, super transparent. I didn't really have a lot of friendships in high school. I was going back. If we're going to talk about like how I do my life differently, I was an obsessed kid. I didn't have, quote unquote, I didn't have time for friends. I thought I was on this mission to graduate early and start college early and get ahead of the game. And now I look back, I'm like, what a joke that was, because I ended up working so hard to start college at 16 and then dropped out of college. So there's a little bit of an irony there. The other thing was to realize I would have been much kinder to people who I now see have suffered. And just little things. How are you doing? Hey, you're okay. Tell me about your problems. Things like that. That's what stood out to me as well. And then the third thing would have been to not care at all about what anybody else thought about me. I had a lot of reputation problems too. I was so worried about, if I do this, people will think of me this way. There was one person in particular that I kind of wished that I'd at least pursued romantically, and I didn't because I was afraid of what others would think about me pursuing her. And at the time, I thought, this is like this really cool person I had feelings for, and I never did anything about it because I was worried about what my friends and family would think about me pursuing that person. And I look back, I'm like, what a joke now. Those that I thought would have judged me had no idea what they were talking about. And I see so much irony in that now. It's actually laughable as a 27-year-old to look back and go, oh man, I can't believe I actually thought that. Because they were so wrong and I was so wrong. And it didn't matter as much as I thought it did. So, of course, this is all pie in the sky, and you never know what actually happened if that scenario were to unfold. But here was another big takeaway, was that I also recognized, I have this belief, by the way, I'm kind of one of those nerdy people who thinks that quantum theory is cool. And I kind of got this little quantum theory kick, which is a little YouTube rabbit hole that I went down. But if there's any truth to it, then all time is happening simultaneously. That time is not linear like we think it is. It's actually all happening at once. And if that's the case, I was like, well, in some type of dimension or form, there is a 65-year-old Brunson right now who is probably thinking back to back when he was 27. I said, I wonder what 65-year-old Brunson would do if he could transfer his conscience back to my age now. What would I do if I knew everything that 65-year-old Brunson knew? And I realized that time seems to be pretty synonymous, and often what's relevant for us now, especially in the core, is relevant for us in the future. So if I were to take a guess, 65-year-old Brunson would probably go back and say, stop worrying so much about wealth for the sake of accolades and status. He'd probably say, be kinder to those around you who are probably suffering more than you realize. He would probably say, avoid bad habits that just, end up being the gift that keeps on giving in the worst possible way. He'd probably say, incorporate good habits. He'd probably say, live without inhibition and don't worry because everyone else is as insecure as you are. And then I would take a guess that most 65-year-olds, we start to think that people as they're older know what's going on. I just don't think anyone does. I think that the older we get, in fact, often the more insecure we get in some ways, because we realize that life is big and the world is big, and we have actually no idea what's really going on. So all of that kind of stood out to me, and I'm kind of curious. If any of you listen to this and want to fire me an email or something, or a message, LinkedIn's probably the easiest way to contact me. But if you have any thoughts on that, let me know, because I think that is a very interesting perspective take on your life. What would your older self say to you now? And I would guess that for most of us, it's going to focus on relationships. It's going to focus on not worrying about what other people think. It's going to focus on how we give and lift others. And I think it's going to focus very, very, very little about here's how to get super rich. I'm sure I'm not going to deny that's a huge thing. I mean, I'm a fairly money motivated person, but I don't think that that's the things that we tend to think about as we get old. So anyways, food for thought.